Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, peace be to you. I'm Pastor Timothy, a member of the CAC Board of Discipleship and Nurture. Welcome to the second talk of the Methodist Social Principles. This is a 3-video teaching series designed to introduce and help us understand the Methodist social principles of the Methodist Church in Singapore. Our speaker for this series is Rev Dr Daniel Koh. In the previous talk, he introduced the history and theology behind the Methodist social principles. If you have not seen the video, you may access it on the CAC Singapore YouTube channel. Now in this talk, Rev Dr Koh will tackle some ongoing social issues that were addressed in the older edition of the Methodist Social Principles and are still dealt with in the revised edition. These are all very relevant issues, such as our stand on the family, consumerism, women's rights, the treatment of domestic helpers, and assisted death. Let us explore these important matters through this video.
Hello, my brothers and sisters. This is the second installment of a 3-part video introducing you to the Methodist Social Principles. And for this second presentation, we shall pick up some of the issues addressed in the older edition of the Methodist Social Principles, but are still retained in the new edition because those are, issues which we continue to grapple with. And these are issues which will demand our attention and attention of people who, are serious about their faith and serious about how they ought to live a responsible Christian life. Let me, however, begin with an overview of how the Methodist Church came to have the Methodist Social Principles, which most denominations do not have. In fact, have you ever wondered how this came about? Well, let me just share a little bit of the history behind the Methodist Social Principles with you. The first attempt to frame a set of social principles for the Methodist Church was drafted in 1908. This was when the old Methodist Episcopal Church in the USA adopted an 11-point statement highlighting what they saw as some pressing social needs at the turn of the last century. It was a very short statement, just 10 items that dealt with socio-economic issues, particularly related to working conditions and the need for fair wages and social justice. The 11th item was a reference to the Golden Rule. I guess this was added as a kind of a broad theological exaltation. Here is a copy of the 1908 statement. Let me just read because it's quite short. So the 1908 Social Creed of the Methodist Episcopal Church. This is what it says. The Methodist Episcopal Church stands for equal rights and complete justice for all people in all stations of life, for the principle of conciliation and arbitration in industrial dissensions, for the protections of workers from dangerous machineries, occupational diseases, injuries, and mortality, for the abolition of child labor, for such regulations of the condition of labor of women as shall safeguard the physical and moral health of the community, for the suppression of sweating system, for the gradual and reasonable reduction of hours of labor to the lowest practical point with work for all, and for the degree of leisure for all which is the condition of the highest human life, for release from employment 1 day in 7, for a living wage in every industry, for the highest wage that each industry can afford, and for the most equitable division of the products of industry that can ultimately be devised, for the reconciliation of the Golden Rule and the mind of Christ as the supreme law of society and the sure remedy of all social ills. It's very short. So this was the first attempt of putting together a Methodist social principles. So if the 1908 statement has only 11 points, which was printed in just one page, the United Methodist Church released a new 2020 edition of the Methodist Social Principles, which has 44 pages. So one page compared with 44 pages. Our own, meaning the Methodist Social Principles of the Methodist Church in Singapore, has 18 pages. This is already considered quite long. But then the previous version was much shorter, of course. The Methodist Social Principles is built on biblical teachings and drawn lessons from our rich Wesleyan tradition. So during the time of Wesley, although we did not have the official Methodist Social Principles, you could see this in the life and also teachings of John Wesley, and how he and the early Methodists were concerned not just for the spiritual well-being of the people, but they were also very much concerned with regard to the social well-being of the people in England, or people whom they ministered to. The principles are therefore reminders of our Methodist or our Wesleyan concern for personal as well as social holiness, affirming our desire for full salvation, which will lead us to avoid evil, to do good, and to obey God. Methodists have always sought to articulate what is good and what is to be avoided in our turbulent and often very troubled world. Following a brief preamble that summarizes the basis for social concerns in our Methodist heritage and theology, our Methodist Social Principles listed out 8 spheres of life, which cover all aspects of our human life, our human living. And the 8 spheres are the sphere of family, the sphere of economics, the sphere of politics, the sphere of community life, the sphere of internet sciences and technologies, the sphere of social well-being, the sphere of creation care, and finally, the sphere of the church. Of course, we will not go into the detailed studies of the various spheres which I've just mentioned. But I encourage you to obtain a copy of the Methodist Social Principles and read this on your own time. And better still, read this with your friends and maybe form a discussion group to look at the details of the Methodist Social Principles. Let me now pick up a few of those perennial, persistent issues covered by our current as well as the previous edition of the Methodist Social Principles. And I will be quoting directly the relevant parts of the Methodist Social Principles. So here are some of the perennial, persistent predicaments, I call them. So under the sphere of family, we said we affirm the importance and sanctity of family. We believe that healthy family unit forms a basic social environment in which responsible teachings can be imparted, moral values disseminated, and where love is shared and the worth of each person is affirmed. And we deplore and reject values and morals which undermine the sanctity of human life. In other words, the family unit that we have been given by God, this is something that we want to protect. This is something that we want to continue to teach. This is something that we value, and this is something that we want to strengthen. And this is something in which we want to offer our praise to God, and as a family to be responsible witnesses to the gospel of Christ as well. So that is the affirmation with regard to the sphere of the family. Under the sphere of economics, we believe all economic systems are under the judgment of God, and that we need to test each aspect of every economic system by the teachings of the Bible, and to judge its practices and impact by its contribution towards the common good. The idea of the common good or social justice is critical. So we want to test any kind of economic systems that a person may adopt or a country may adopt against how this may impact the well-being of the population. And when we talk about well-being of populations, we mean well-being of everyone in a community and not just the privileged few, everyone. And under this sphere of economics, there is also a call for us Christians to consider living a simpler lifestyle. So we want to call on all Christians, we said, to adopt a simple lifestyle, to be ever conscious and vigilant against the influence of consumerism, which thrives on pride, greed, and human propensity to acquire more than we need. And we also say a simple lifestyle does not necessarily equate to a call for an ascetic life. That's not what it means. It is a spiritual discipline which promotes godliness with contentment, to use a Pauline term. And it will help us to increase our awareness of God's presence and God's providence in our life. A simple lifestyle frees us to be more sensitive to the needs of the poor and the beauty of God's world. And I move now to the sphere of community life. And there, under the sphere of community life, we have some of this mentioned. We recognize that Singapore is a multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious society, and we believe that everyone is of equal worth in God's sight, regardless of our creed, race, sex, age, social life, or even educational status. We seek to work towards society in which each person's unique value is recognized, affirmed, and strengthened. I think this is reflective of the reality of where we are in Singapore. And we also stress about multi-religious understanding. And here we say we believe that it is necessary and healthy to engage in open and honest dialogue with persons of other faiths in a spirit of love, mutual respect, and sensitivity. And we also added, we affirm the right of religious groups to exercise their faith without undue legal, political, or financial impediments. So we should be free to be able to share the gospel of Christ, just as others should also be given that freedom to share their faith. But all this must be done sensitively, and I hope for Christians humbly as well. Then about racial harmony, we said we believe that a key foundation of racial harmony is love, mutual respect, and acceptance of our neighbors, regardless of their race and religious beliefs. Let me just sidetrack a bit. When we talk about people of different faiths, sometimes even in our own family, for some of us, our parents may be Buddhists, although we are Christian. And maybe one of our brothers may be an atheist or an agnostic. So when we talk about harmony and so on, it's not just our family living with people next door or people in the neighborhood, but even within our own family, we need also to learn how to cultivate that kind of harmony too. Racism inhabits and cripples our growth in Christ, as it is antithetical to the gospel itself. Racial pride and prejudice left unchecked is potential source of interracial strife and conflict. So we have quite a lot to say with regard to racial harmony, multi-religious society, and this we stress also mainly because the context in which we are in when we look at Singapore. Then we move on to different kind of rights. The rights of women, the rights of the ages, the rights of children, and so on. Now, those are important rights which we need to consider too. Just recently in Singapore, those of us who follow the news, the government has also come out with a white paper to help us appreciate more the roles of women in our society and how they should be better treated than how they were treated before. So the rights of women, the rights of the seniors, that is to say, the rights of the elderly. Then there is the sphere of social well-being. We affirm that it is a Christian virtue for a person to place the overall interest and welfare of the community before the interest of the self. Each person has been endowed with gifts and graces which can contribute to the development of a compassionate society. And under this section, we talk about the promotion of workers' welfare. You can read more about that in the documents which you should get hold of. We talk about the importance of supporting public and private programs to provide economic security for old age and adequate insurance coverage for people who are sick and people who may be injured. We also talk about the dignity of labor and how we should help people to find job as well. And there is also a paragraph that speaks of domestic helpers and migrant workers. We also urge Christian employers of domestic helpers and migrant workers to regard such employment as an opportunity for ministry to those from the less developed countries. And our care for them and how well we treat them is part and parcel of our Christian witness. And we also mention something about death, dying, and euthanasia. This is going to be something that will probably be surfaced more often than in the past, when people will be asking, why can't we let someone die if that person is suffering so much? So euthanasia, what is our stand with regard to euthanasia? Let me just close this second video by saying that I have only touched on a very few issues. These are issues which were addressed in the previous Methodist Social Principles, but we continue to address them in our current edition of the Methodist Social Principles. So some of them are controversial and disturbing, but most of them will continue to press us for appropriate response. The Methodist Social Principles provided markers and guidelines to help Christians navigate sometimes troublesome and definitely troubling world. There are newer issues which are included in the current edition of the Methodist Social Principles, but that will be covered in the final part of our series of talks.
I hope this session has raised your awareness on these important social issues. Once again, there are questions provided for you to discuss in your small groups. You may pause the video to take a look at each question before you proceed with the next one. May you have a fruitful and enriching time of discussion with one another. May the Lord bless you.